The Labyrinth of Greed, the story of the endless caves, the gold reef passage, and the marsh gate friskers. Chapter 1. The Mission and the Marsh Gate. The jungle seemed alive with whispers as Dr. Carter followed his guides through the dense undergrowth. The air was thick with moisture, the kind that clung to your skin and sank deep into your bones. The jungle sounds, chirping insects, distant howls, and the rustle of unseen creatures, faded as they approached the marsh gate, leaving only an eerie, suffocating silence. The marsh gate lay ahead, shrouded in a mist that coiled like ghostly tendrils around the massive mangroves rising out of the water. It was wider than Dr. Carter had imagined, a stretch of knee-deep, still water bordered by thick vegetation. The water's surface was smooth as glass, reflecting the pale shafts of sunlight filtering through the canopy above. Something about the marsh felt wrong, unnaturally quiet, as if the jungle itself was holding its breath. "Here we are," muttered one of the guides, his voice low, almost reverent. "We must move slowly now." Dr. Carter nodded, gripping the strap of his pack. He had heard the tales, how the marsh gate friskers waited beneath the water, pale-skinned spirits with hollow eyes, dragging noisy intruders down to the depths. The friskers were ghosts of murder victims during the early gold rush in the mountain caves. The stories were old, told with such conviction by the locals that they bordered on fact. Dr. Carter didn't believe in ghosts, but there was an unease here that even he couldn't explain. The lead guide turned, holding a finger to his lips. "Step carefully," he whispered. "One wrong move, one loud splash, and they will come." Dr. Carter's breath caught as he followed the group into the water. The marsh was cold, colder than it should have been, and each step sent a faint ripple spreading outward. The guides moved with practiced ease, their footsteps creating barely a whisper of disturbance. Dr. Carter tried to mimic their grace, but his boots felt clumsy, the water gripping his legs like invisible hands. As they waded deeper, the oppressive silence grew heavier. The stillness was so profound that even the faintest splash echoed unnaturally, like a warning bell. Dr. Carter glanced down at the water. It was murky, its depths obscured by floating vegetation and creeping shadows. He thought he saw something move, a flicker of pale white just below the surface, but when he looked again, it was gone. The youngest guide, a boy of no more than 16, paused suddenly, his eyes wide with fear. "Did you see that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The lead guide hissed sharply, "Keep moving! Don't look down! Don't stop!" Dr. Carter's heart raced, his mind conjuring images of the creatures the locals had described. Lithe, ghostly forms with translucent skin, their bony fingers reaching for anything they could claim. He shook his head, forcing himself to focus. He was a man of science, a cartographer, here to map the unknown. The stories were just that, stories. Yet, as they pressed forward, the water seemed to grow colder, the air heavier. A faint rhythmic thrum began to pulse through the ground beneath the water, so faint it could have been his imagination. But Dr. Carter wasn't sure. He tightened his grip on his pack, his muscles tensing with every step. Halfway across, the group froze. From somewhere deep within the marsh came a sound, a low, resonant hum, like the moan of a distant wind. It was barely audible, but it sent a chill down Dr. Carter's spine. The lead guide turned slowly, his eyes scanning the water. "Keep moving," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Slowly." They resumed their march, each step excruciatingly deliberate. Dr. Carter's nerves were frayed, every fiber of his being attuned to the unnatural silence around them. The hum grew louder, almost imperceptibly, as if something beneath the water was stirring, watching. A sudden splash shattered the silence. The young guide had stumbled, his foot catching on a submerged root. He flailed, his hands slapping the water as he fought to regain his balance. The lead guide cursed under his breath, rushing to steady the boy. "Quiet!" he hissed, his voice sharp with panic. The marsh erupted. The water beneath them rippled violently, and the faint hum turned into a guttural, otherworldly groan. Dr. Carter's eyes darted to the surface, where the pale flickers of movement he had glimpsed earlier were now unmistakable. Shadows twisted and writhed beneath the water, circling them like predators. "Move!" the lead guide barked, his calm composure shattered. "Now!" They hurried forward, abandoning all pretense of silence. The marsh churned around them as if alive, the water's surface breaking in places where pale skeletal forms breached briefly before sinking again. Dr. Carter's pulse thundered in his ears as he pushed forward, each step feeling slower than the last. The young guide whimpered, clinging to the lead guide's arm as they stumbled toward the far edge of the marsh. Dr. Carter dared a glance back. The shadows were closer now, the pale forms more defined. He saw faces, hollow-eyed and grotesque, their expressions contorted in eternal anguish. One of them rose almost to the surface, its hand outstretched, reaching for the youngest guide. "No!" the lead guide roared, yanking the boy forward. The creature's hand missed by mere inches, disappearing back into the depths with a guttural hiss. Finally, they reached the edge of the marsh. The guides scrambled onto dry land, pulling Dr. Carter with them. The marsh stilled almost instantly, its surface returning to an unnatural calm, as if nothing had happened. The only sound was their ragged breathing. The lead guide turned to Dr. Carter, his face pale and drawn. "Do you believe now?" he asked, his voice low and grave. Dr. Carter didn't answer. He stared back at the marsh, its waters dark and unyielding, and for the first time he felt a sliver of doubt in his scientific certainty. Whatever lay beneath those waters, it was no myth, and it wasn't finished with him yet. Chapter 2. Into the Labyrinth. The yawning entrance of the endless caves loomed before them like the mouth of a sleeping beast. Stalactites hung down like jagged teeth, glistening faintly in the muted light filtering through the jungle canopy. The air grew cooler with each step, carrying a strange, metallic tang that made the hairs on Dr. Carter's neck stand on end. Behind him, his guides exchanged uneasy glances, but said nothing. The silence of the place demanded reverence, broken only by the occasional drip of water echoing from unseen depths. Dr. Carter adjusted his headlamp and stepped forward. The beam of light illuminated a world both alien and magnificent. The floor was a mosaic of glistening minerals, wet with condensation that refracted his light into ghostly rainbows. Strange formations jutted from the ground and ceiling, resembling ancient spires and crumbling statues carved by some forgotten hand. It was as if the cave itself were alive, breathing in a rhythm too slow to perceive. "This way," one of the guides murmured, pointing to a narrow passage ahead. His voice was little more than a whisper, as if he feared waking something. The guides moved with practiced precision, their steps deliberate and quiet, avoiding loose rocks or puddles that might betray their presence. Dr. Carter followed, his pulse quickening with a mix of exhilaration and unease. The passage twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the belly of the earth. Strange sounds began to echo through the tunnels, low, mournful whistles and the occasional faint thud, like the distant beating of a giant heart. Dr. Carter stopped at one point, turning his head to listen. "What is that?" he calmly asked. The lead guide, a wiry man named Rolu, shook his head. "The cave speaks. It is best not to answer." The answer was cryptic, but Dr. Carter pressed no further. He had now learned to respect the wisdom of those who lived in these remote places. Instead, he focused on the task at hand, marking their path with chalk as he carefully sketched the contours of the cave walls. The work steadied his nerves, anchoring him in the familiar patterns of his craft. As they pressed on, the cave began to reveal its secrets. In one chamber, the walls shimmered with a faint blue light, a phenomenon Dr. Carter attributed to bioluminescent fungi. The guides, however, refused to enter the chamber, whispering prayers and averting their eyes. Dr. Carter lingered just long enough to make a quick sketch, feeling a prickling sensation on his skin, as if the air itself were alive. Deeper still, they came upon a vast underground lake, its surface as still and black as obsidian. Dr. Carter's light could not penetrate its depths, and when he knelt to examine the water, he felt an inexplicable chill creep up his spine. There were no ripples, no signs of life, only an oppressive stillness that seemed to drink in sound. "We do not linger here," Rolu said sharply, pulling him back. "The water does not forgive." Despite his skepticism, Dr. Carter obeyed, following the guides around the lake and into another passage. The walls here were smoother, almost polished, and the air grew warmer. The metallic scent intensified, mingling with a faint sulfuric tang that made breathing slightly uncomfortable. Rolu muttered something in his native tongue, and the other guides nodded grimly. "What did you say?" Dr. Carter asked. Rolu hesitated before answering. "We are near the veins." The words sent a thrill through Dr. Carter. The fabled gold veins, rumored to crisscross these mountains, were part of the legends he had dismissed as folklore. Yet the guides' somber expressions gave him pause. They moved with even greater caution now, their eyes darting to every shadow, every crack in the walls. It was as if they were being watched. At last, they entered a narrow corridor where the walls glowed faintly, veins of a golden hue running through the rock like the arteries of some giant slumbering creature. Dr. Carter stared in awe, momentarily forgetting the oppressive atmosphere. Here was proof of the stories, tangible and undeniable. He reached out to touch the rock, marveling at its texture. It was cool and smooth, yet it seemed to pulse faintly under his fingers. "Do not touch!" Rolu said sharply. His voice carried an edge of fear. "The veins are alive." Dr. Carter frowned, but withdrew his hand. He wanted to argue, to dismiss the statement as superstition, but something in Rolu's tone stopped him. The guides hurried him along, their movements tense and hurried. The further they went, the more oppressive the cave became. The air seemed heavier, and the walls began to close in, the passages narrowing until they had to move single file. Dr. Carter's heart raced as the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Shadows danced at the edge of his light, and he could have sworn he heard faint whispers, like the murmur of a distant crowd. They reached a fork in the path, and the guides halted. Rolu knelt to examine the ground, his brow furrowed in concentration. After a moment, he pointed to the left passage. "We take this way. The other is wrong." Dr. Carter didn't need to ask what he meant. The other passage exuded a cold, malevolent air, as if daring them to enter. He nodded and followed the guides down the chosen path, resisting the urge to look back. The journey continued for what felt like hours, the oppressive atmosphere weighing heavier with each step. Just as Dr. Carter began to question whether they would ever find an end to the labyrinth, the passage opened into another chamber. This one was vast, its ceiling lost in darkness. A faint golden light emanated from the far end, where the rock walls seemed to shimmer and shift, as if alive. Rolu froze, his face pale. We should not have come this far. Before Dr. Carter could respond, the ground beneath them trembled, and a low, guttural sound echoed through the chamber. It was not the sound of stone or water, but something deeper, something alive. The air grew colder, and the golden light seemed to pulse, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "Back!" Rolu hissed, his voice trembling. "We must go back!" But it was too late. The labyrinth had woken, and it was watching. Chapter 3. The Gold Vein. The air inside the caves was cool, damp, and carried an almost tangible weight of ancient silence. Dr. Carter pressed his hand against the rugged limestone wall, running his fingers over its rough texture as he marked a new turn on his map. His lantern's flickering glow danced across the uneven surfaces, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and writhe like living creatures. His guides followed behind him, their quiet murmurs in the local dialect betraying their unease. The cave had grown wider, its ceilings towering above like the vaulted halls of a cathedral. Stalactites hung like jagged teeth, and the sound of dripping water echoed rhythmically in the vast space. Every now and then, a faint, metallic tang lingered in the air, an odd smell that didn't belong to the usual scent of damp earth and moss. "Carter!" one of the guides called out, his voice edged with anxiety. "This part of the cave, it is not good." Dr. Carter paused, glancing back at the speaker. He had learned to take the guide's instincts seriously, but curiosity burned brighter than caution in his heart. "Why not?" he asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. The guide exchanged a nervous glance with his companion. "Gold is near. Too near." Carter raised an eyebrow. "And that's a problem?" "The gold calls trouble," the guide replied cryptically, shaking his head. "We should turn back." But Carter didn't turn back. Something had shifted in the atmosphere of the cave, an electric undercurrent that made his skin prickle. He adjusted his lantern and pressed forward, the metallic scent growing stronger with each step. Then, as he turned a corner, he froze. Before him, a massive vein of gold ran through the rock wall, gleaming dully in the lantern light. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, the metallic luster catching the light and refracting it into warm, otherworldly hues. The vein stretched across the wall like a crack in reality, a bold slash of wealth that whispered promises of fortune and ruin. Dr. Carter stared, his breath caught in his throat. He stepped closer, mesmerized, and reached out a hand. The gold was cold to the touch, its smooth surface strangely alien against the jagged rock. He let out a low whistle, his mind racing with possibilities. "This must be one of the legendary veins," he murmured, almost to himself. "The origin of all those stories." The guides stayed back, their faces pale. One of them crossed his arms tightly, as though trying to ward off an invisible chill. "Carter," he said again, his voice sharper this time. "We go now." But Carter barely heard him. His logical mind, the part trained to analyze, measure, and document, was overwhelmed by the primal allure of the treasure before him. It wasn't just the value of the gold. It was the sheer improbability of it, the idea that something so magnificent could remain hidden for centuries, buried in the depths of the earth. He felt a pang of guilt. He had promised himself that this expedition was about the caves, about the maps, about discovery. Yet here he was, captivated by the very thing he had sworn to ignore. The gold wasn't part of his mission, yet the weight of its potential seemed unbearable to resist. Dr. Carter turned to his guides. "We've come this far. We can't just leave without taking a closer look. A small sample, at least." The guides recoiled, their eyes widening in alarm. "No," one of them said firmly. "This gold is cursed. You take it, and the caves will turn against you. The passages will shift, and the way out will vanish. Leave it, or you will be trapped." "Cursed?" Carter scoffed. "You really believe that?" The guide's expression darkened. "The gold listens, Carter. It has a voice. It speaks to the mountain, and the mountain answers." Dr. Carter hesitated. The rational part of him dismissed the superstition as local folklore, but something about the guide's tone, a deep, unshakable fear, made him uneasy. Still, the weight of temptation was too great. He couldn't simply walk away. "I'll be careful," he said at last, his voice firmer than he felt. "You don't have to touch it. Just wait here." The guides exchanged a look. Then, one by one, they stepped back into the shadows. Carter turned back to the gold. He retrieved a chisel from his pack and struck it against the vein. The sharp clang echoed through the cavern like a gunshot, and for a moment the entire cave seemed to hold its breath. A small chunk of gold broke free, landing in his hand with a dull thud. He stared at it, the weight of the metal heavier than he expected. It glimmered like a captured sun, and a small, irrepressible smile tugged at his lips. He slipped the chunk into his pack, his heart racing. Then the ground trembled. It was subtle at first, a faint vibration that ran through the soles of his boots, but it quickly grew stronger, the walls shuddering as pebbles and dust rained from above. The guides shouted in alarm, their voices lost in the growing rumble. "Run!" one of them yelled. "The mountain knows!" The lantern flickered violently, casting chaotic shadows across the cavern. Dr. Carter staggered backward, his mind racing. He grabbed his map, his instincts screaming at him to retreat. But as he turned, he realized the passages were no longer the same. The path he had come from had shifted, replaced by a jagged, unfamiliar tunnel. Panic clawed at his chest. The guides, already several steps ahead, stopped in their tracks, their faces pale with dread. "This is what we warned you," one of them said, his voice trembling. "The mountain will not let you leave with the gold." Carter tried to follow them, but they shook their heads and pointed back toward the cavern. "You brought this curse. You must find your own way out." Before he could protest, they disappeared into the darkness, their footsteps fading into silence. Dr. Carter was alone with the gold, the shifting tunnels, and the weight of a decision that now felt impossibly heavy. The mountain had awakened, and it was not pleased. Chapter 4. The Prospectors. Dr. Carter wandered through the cave, trying to find a way out with the gold. As he moved cautiously through the twisting corridors, the echoes of his footsteps seemed louder, as though the cavern itself was listening. Suddenly, he stopped. Voices, faint but distinct, they floated through the air like whispers carried on an invisible breeze. His heart quickened. For hours, he'd been alone, his guides having fled the cursed cave system after the passages began shifting. The idea of encountering other people was both comforting and alarming. He hesitated, unsure if he should move forward or remain hidden. The stories of the cave prospectors, desperate and driven by greed, loomed in his mind. Summoning his courage, Dr. Carter pressed on, rounding a sharp bend. His headlamp illuminated two figures hunched near a narrow tunnel opening. They looked ragged, clothes torn, faces smeared with dirt and sweat. The first was a wiry man with sharp, darting eyes and a face lined with desperation. The other was larger, his broad shoulders giving him an imposing presence despite the weariness etched into his features. "Who's there?" the wiry man barked, spinning around. His eyes caught the glint of Dr. Carter's lamp, narrowing suspiciously. "I'm Dr. Carter," he said, keeping his voice steady and his hands visible. "A cartographer. I'm mapping the caves." The larger man straightened, his expression softening into a mix of relief and wariness. "We thought we were the only ones left down here," he said. "Name's Gerald. This here's Bane." "What's a mapmaker doing down here?" Bane snapped, suspicion dripping from his words. His gaze darted to Dr. Carter's satchel, where the faint glimmer of gold peeked from its flap. Dr. Carter hesitated before responding. "Same as you, I suppose. Exploring. But the caves, they've been shifting since I found that vein back there." At the mention of the gold vein, both men stiffened, their eyes gleaming in the dim light. Gerald stepped forward, his tone softening but still tense. "You found a vein? You're carrying gold?" Dr. Carter's pulse quickened. He suddenly felt the weight of the gold in his bag, like an anchor dragging him into the earth. "A little," he admitted cautiously, his instincts screaming to defuse the situation. "But I'm more interested in finding a way out. The passages aren't stable." "You're telling us," Bane grunted, glancing around nervously. "We've been down here for days. No food, no gold, and no way out. Every path we take brings us back to the same cursed places." "But you—" Gerald's eyes narrowed. "You've got gold. And yet you're still breathing. How'd you do it?" Dr. Carter realized the danger he was in. These men were cornered animals, desperate for survival and salvation. He took a slow step back. "The gold isn't worth it," he said carefully. "The passages have their own rules. You carry too much and they trap you. And the marsh gate—" "Spare us the ghost stories," Bane interrupted, his voice sharp. "We've heard all about the marsh gate friskers. Nothing but local superstition." "It's not superstition," Dr. Carter snapped, surprising even himself. He pointed toward the tunnel he had just traversed. "I've seen what happens when you defy this place. It's not just shifting passages. The caves are alive." Gerald and Bane exchanged a glance, the tension between them palpable. Then Gerald stepped closer, a sly smile playing on his lips. "Tell you what, Doc, hand over that gold, and maybe we'll help you find a way out." Dr. Carter's grip on his satchel tightened. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice low. "The gold won't save you. It'll only—" "Give it here!" Bane barked, lunging forward. In an instant, Dr. Carter was shoved against the jagged wall, the air knocked from his lungs. Gerald reached for the satchel, yanking it free with a triumphant laugh. "Let's see how cursed it really is," Gerald sneered, pulling out a chunk of the shimmering gold. "Come on, Bane. The marsh gate's the quickest way out. We'll be rich before this fool can find his bearings." Dr. Carter struggled to his feet, his voice desperate. "Don't do this! The marsh gate! It won't let you pass with the gold!" But his warnings fell on deaf ears. Gerald and Bane disappeared down the tunnel, their laughter echoing ominously. Dr. Carter stood frozen, a sinking feeling in his chest. He had no choice but to follow. Hours later, the faint sound of a distant scream reached his ears. a chilling echo that sent shivers down his spine. He tightened his grip on his lantern and pressed on, unsure whether the screams were real or imagined. Something in the air shifted as he stumbled across to the edge of the marsh gate. The air was thick with the pungent smell of decay and stagnant water. His headlamp illuminated the dark, murky swamp. And there, floating just beneath the surface, were the bodies of Gerald and Bane. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with terror. Around them, the water seemed to ripple unnaturally, as though something just beneath the surface was watching. The gold they had stolen gleamed faintly in the dark water, untouched but deadly. Dr. Carter swallowed hard, his breath shallow. The legends were true. The Marshgate friskers were real, and they were unforgiving. He backed away slowly, his mind racing. He had read that the marsh friskers only drag people below the marsh to check for gold and weapons, and those with neither are let go. But he was not sure. He did not want to risk it. He knew he had touched the gold, and he might have some grams in his bag. If even a sliver of gold had doomed the prospectors, there was no safe way through the marsh. He turned back toward the caves, heart pounding. His only hope lay in the treacherous gold reef passage, a gamble he wasn't sure he could survive. But if there was one lesson he had learned, it was this: greed had no place in the endless caves. Chapter 5. The Decision and the Gold Reef Passage. The walls of the cavern seemed alive, the flickering torchlight casting restless shadows that danced and warped, as if mocking Dr. Carter's predicament. His breath came in ragged gasps as he leaned against the rough stone, his pack feeling unnaturally heavy on his back. He couldn't stop seeing them, the prospectors' bloated bodies, floating eerily still in the marsh gate, their eyes wide open in frozen terror. The faint shimmer of their stolen gold scattered beneath the water lingered in his mind, a haunting reminder of what he carried. Gold grams, remnants of the big gold chunk the prospectors stole. The caves, ever shifting, had led him dangerously close to the marsh gate once again. The distant sound of trickling water echoed like a cruel whisper in the dark. He knew what awaited him if he attempted the marsh exit with gold. An inescapable death at the hands of the mythical creatures. Their ghostly pale, spectral translucent forms lurked just beneath the surface, waiting. He set his pack down and stared at the golden nuggets gleaming in the dim light. Each piece was a testament to ancient riches, veins of pure gold that could make him a legend, a wealthy man far beyond his wildest dreams. But what good was wealth if it cost him his life? His fingers trembled as he reached into the pack, pulling out a large, jagged nugget. It was cold, heavy, and beautiful, yet it felt like holding a curse. "No gold," he muttered to himself, his voice echoing faintly in the cavern. "They said, no gold can leave this place." But the thought of abandoning it all sent a pang through his chest. What if he could outwit the curse? What if the legends were exaggerated? The marsh gate friskers seemed to operate on primal instincts. Perhaps there was a way to bypass them entirely. Yet deep in his heart, he knew the truth. The marsh gate was no place for anyone carrying even a sliver of gold. Dr. Carter crouched down and began to sort through his pack. With every piece of gold he discarded, a strange lightness crept over him. Not just the physical relief of a lighter load, but a mental clarity, a sense of self-preservation, awakening from the haze of greed. He left behind nearly everything, save for a small nugget, an insignificant trinket compared to the riches he had found. It would serve as a reminder of this cursed expedition, should he survive. He rose, shouldering his pack and gripping his torch. His decision was made. He would not tempt fate at the marsh gate. The caves had shown him another exit, the infamous Gold Reef Passage, known for its lethal cliffs and treacherous footing. If survival lay anywhere, it was there. The path back to the labyrinth. Navigating the caves alone was no easy feat. The air was cold and damp, and every step echoed into the unseen distance, as if the caves themselves were alive, watching him. The passages had shifted since the last time he had traversed them, as if the caves sought to trap him deeper within their belly. He marked his way with pieces of chalk, scribbling crude arrows on the stone walls and muttering prayers under his breath. After what felt like hours, he saw it. The entrance to the Gold Reef Passage, a gaping maw in the stone framed by glittering remains of what was veins of gold. Earlier prospectors had stripped these veins of most of the gold. But at what cost? Most of them now lay at the bottomless abyss of the Gold Reef Passage. The torchlight made the walls glisten like fireflies caught in amber, but Dr. Carter felt no awe, only dread. "This is it," he whispered. The steep, jagged path beyond looked like the spine of a beast ready to devour him whole. The first trial. The razor's edge. The passage began with a narrow ledge barely wide enough for a single footstep. Below him stretched a bottomless abyss, shrouded in darkness. Dr. Carter pressed his back against the cliffside, his fingers digging into the rough stone for stability. The rock crumbled slightly beneath his boots, sending small pebbles tumbling into the void. "Don't look down," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own heartbeat. Step by step, he inched forward. The ledge grew narrower, and the wind howled through the passage like a mournful wail. It tugged at his clothing and threatened to unbalance him, but he pressed on. Halfway across, a section of the ledge gave way. Dr. Carter fell to his knees, his fingers scrabbling at the stone as his pack shifted dangerously. For a terrifying moment, he dangled over the edge, his legs kicking into empty space. With a desperate grunt, he hauled himself back onto the ledge, his breath ragged and his heart pounding. The maze of gold. Further into the passage, the path split into several glittering tunnels, each glimmering with what seemed to be left of what was veins of gold. The air grew oppressive, and the faint sound of whispers echoed in the distance. An auditory trick of the caves, or something more sinister? Dr. Carter's instincts screamed at him to move quickly, but he forced himself to stop and study the markings earlier prospectors had made. "This one," he decided, choosing the leftmost tunnel. It spiraled downward, steep and slippery. He marked his way diligently, fighting off the growing disorientation as the shimmering walls seemed to shift around him, playing tricks on his eyes. The final push. The collapsing bridge. At the end of the tunnel lay the most harrowing obstacle yet. A makeshift bridge of loose stones spanning a massive chasm. The air was thick with dust, and the faint sound of rushing water echoed from far below. Dr. Carter tested the first stone, and it wobbled precariously beneath his weight. There was no other way. Taking a deep breath, he began to cross, his steps light and deliberate. Halfway across, the ground beneath him shifted violently as the stones began to collapse. He broke into a sprint, the bridge crumbling behind him with every step. The final stretch was the longest, an impossible leap that sent him soaring through the air, his arms outstretched. He landed hard on the other side, the impact jarring every bone in his body. Behind him, the bridge gave way entirely, the stones plunging into the abyss with a deafening crash. Dr. Carter lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, the torchlight flickering weakly in his hand. The light of freedom. Dragging himself to his feet, he saw the faint glow of daylight filtering through a narrow opening in the rock. Relief washed over him as he stumbled toward it, emerging at last from the cursed caves. The sunlight was blinding, the air crisp and cool. Dr. Carter collapsed onto the ground, the weight of his ordeal crashing over him. For the first time in days, he felt free, not just from the caves, but from the greed that had nearly consumed him. As he gazed back at the entrance to the gold reef passage, the faint shimmer of gold glinted from the rocks, a silent warning to all who dared enter the endless caves. Chapter 6. The Resolution. The sky was painted with streaks of gold and crimson as the sun began its descent, casting long, jagged shadows across the mountain range. Dr. Carter stood on a rocky outcrop overlooking the jungle below, the biting wind tugging at his tattered clothes. His body ached with exhaustion, every muscle trembling after the ordeal of the gold reef passage, but he couldn't take his eyes off the gaping maw of the endless caves behind him. The caves loomed like a living entity, breathing in the wind, watching him with unseen eyes. He shivered, not from the cold, but from the weight of what he had survived. The tales, the warnings, the eerie curses. Everything he had dismissed as folklore had come to life within those cavernous walls. His fingers unconsciously brushed against the remains of the gold nugget he'd tucked away, his one small memento from the treasure trove he'd left behind. It felt heavier than it should, as though it carried not just its physical weight, but the burden of his choices. Far below, the marsh gate glimmered faintly under the fading light. He couldn't shake the image of the prospectors' pale, lifeless bodies drifting among the reeds, their expressions frozen in perpetual terror. The marsh gate friskers had been more than myth. They had been gatekeepers of the cursed treasure, exacting justice on those who dared to defy the cave's laws. His survival felt like a fragile miracle. Dr. Carter crouched by a small fire he'd managed to ignite using flint and dry moss he found along the way. The firelight danced against the rock walls, creating the illusion of shadowy figures moving just beyond his line of sight. He welcomed the solitude. The jungle sounds that would normally unsettle him now felt like an orchestra of life, a stark contrast to the suffocating silence of the caves. He pulled out his weathered notebook, the pages damp and smudged, but still legible. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to relive the journey, sketching the chaotic twists and turns of the endless caves. His hands trembled as he marked the gold reef passage with a jagged line, a testament to its brutality. He paused over the marsh gate, hesitating before sketching its haunting stillness. "I was wrong," he muttered to the empty air. "The caves are alive. They don't want to be tamed." The realization washed over him like the jungle rain. He had ventured into the caves, seeking to map them, to conquer their mystery with lines and measurements. But the caves had their own will, their own guardians. They weren't just stone and shadow. They were a living entity that demanded respect, and Dr. Carter, like so many before him, had been an intruder. Morning broke with an eerie clarity. The mountain mist hung low, draping the landscape in an ethereal veil. As he packed his belongings, Dr. Carter turned back to the cave's entrance one final time. He thought of the guides who had abandoned him, their warnings now ringing true. He thought of the prospectors and their greed, how it had led them to the marsh gate's deadly grasp. And he thought of the gold he had abandoned, gold that could have made him rich, but would have cost him his life. The endless caves would remain unmapped, at least by his hand, but the stories they whispered to him would echo forever in his mind. As he descended the jungle trail, he encountered a group of indigenous villagers. Their expressions shifted from surprise to curiosity as they noticed his haggard appearance and empty satchel. One of the elders stepped forward, her weathered face alight with knowing. "You went deeper than most," she said in a voice as soft as the wind through the leaves. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Dr. Carter hesitated. He thought of the gold, the shifting passages, the marsh gate friskers, but most of all, he thought of the raw, unrelenting beauty of the caves, their defiance against those who sought to control them. "I found something," he replied, his voice heavy with both truth and omission. "But it wasn't gold." The elder nodded, her eyes piercing as if she understood more than he had spoken. She gestured for him to sit, and the villagers shared a meal of roasted plantains and spiced roots. For the first time in days, Dr. Carter felt warmth, not just from the food, but from their quiet acceptance. These people who lived alongside the caves seemed to know their secrets, but chose to leave them undisturbed. Days later, as Dr. Carter boarded the rickety jeep that would take him away from the jungle, he turned for one last glimpse of the mountain range. The caves were hidden behind layers of foliage and mist, but he could still feel their presence, a silent guardian of untold stories and unclaimed treasures. The driver, a wiry man with a gap-toothed grin, asked, "Did you find anything interesting out there, Professor?" Dr. Carter chuckled softly, running a hand over his notebook. "More than I bargained for." As the jeep rattled down the bumpy road, Dr. Carter knew his work wasn't done. The caves would haunt him, not as a challenge to conquer, but as a mystery to preserve. He would share the story of the endless caves, not as a tale of riches, but as a testament to the forces of nature, the lure of greed, and the courage it takes to let go. In his mind's eye, he saw the marsh gate shimmer once more, a portal between worlds, and deep within its waters he imagined the ghostly friskers watching, waiting, guarding their realm.